An international agreement to limit shark exports wins broad support at a conference on endangered species, even though it stopped short of a full ban. What will it take to enforce the deal? And is stopping the illegal trade in endangered species even possible? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, has wrapped up in Bangkok. The delegates have agreed on sanctions for countries that support trafficking in rhino horns and ivory. They also struck a deal on trying to stop the illegal trade in sharks and manta rays. But how will the measures be enforced? Tarek Basley reports.
Every 3 years, governments, scientists and conservationists come together to discuss what they can do to protect threatened species. Trade in more than 35,000 species is already limited, if not banned. But as the world's population grows and the effects of climate change become more pronounced, thousands more plants and animals come under threat. At the meeting, governments increased protection for the South African rhino. They've put pressure on Mozambique, a major transit point for rhino horns, and also on Vietnam, the major importer. They've also moved to protect 5 species of sharks. A permit system will now control the trade in their fins. Bad news, though, for those hoping for trade sanctions against countries engaged in the ivory trade. Instead, all countries will have to report their stockpiles of ivory, and 9 countries have been given a year to improve enforcement.
They are putting in place measures for traceability, for putting in place new measures like controlled deliveries. This is a technique used in combating narcotics that allows you to find the kingpin. The parties here have actually focused on the ground. What framework do we need to provide further support to people serving in the front line?
But conservationists say anything short of a global ban creates uncertainty, which is exploited by poachers and traders.
You need a ban when it comes to highly endangered species. That sends a very clear signal that there should be no hunting or trade. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of fuzziness regarding many of these species. So I do think CITES fell short.
The delegates also agreed to restrict the trade in Siam rosewood. But like all other species listed under the convention, the actual job of stopping the illegal trade now falls on individual countries.
There's a right of nations to have stricter domestic measures than CITES, and I think it's up to them to use that, effectively. Of course, some nations are not going to do it, but if a lot more can, I think that would be a great deal of progress.
Countries now have 18 months to introduce new measures to protect 5 species of sharks. But as with many threatened species, conservationists say enforcement is just a first step. Countries also need to find ways of reducing the demand for the animals and animal products, and only that can ensure their long-term survival. Tarek Basley, Al Jazeera.
For more on this, I'm joined by our guests in Bangkok, Colman O'Criodain, a trade policy analyst at the World Wildlife Fund. He's worked on wildlife trade issues relating to CITES for the EU. Susan Lieberman, head of the Pew's Environmental Trust CITES delegation, is also in Bangkok. Susan is a specialist in international environmental policy, and in London, Tom Quinn from the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Welcome to you all. Colman, CITES over for another 3 years. Says some good news. It's a good day for some species of sharks and manta rays. Tell us about it.
Yes, I think this has really been a historic conference. The conference agreed to include 5 species of shark and 2 species of manta ray in the list of species where trade is regulated and subject to legal scrutiny and scrutiny to ensure that it's sustainable. So a great day.
And how do you implement these new laws, these new rules?
Well, what it means is that countries that want to export these sharks, they have to make a scientific determination that the overall catch is sustainable, and they have to certify that the fishing that led to the catch of the shark is legal, that it's complying with all relevant fisheries rules. And only when they do that are they legally allowed to issue an export permit.
Susan, are you equally buoyed? Do you believe it's going to work?
We do believe it's going to work, and the Pew Environment Group and myself in particular, I've been working on CITES since 1988. This was a great day and a great conference, in particular for these ocean species. It's going to work. The governments have decided to wait 18 months to give time for capacity building and training, but this was historic in listing these shark species and the 2 manta rays. But more than that, this was historic in the governments of the world agreeing that CITES, this Convention on Trade in Endangered Species that regulates international trade in wildlife products, is relevant and important for sharks and manta rays. These marine species, the government said, should not be traded and eaten into extinction. We think it was extremely historic what was finally decided here today.
Fantastic. Tom, obviously you're not in Bangkok, but I know that you are aware of how these meetings work. Tell us about the lobbying and the politicking behind all of this.
Well, clearly for sharks, there was a lot of lobbying that had to take place. Some countries, China and Japan, were not supportive of these species being uplisted, so a lot of lobbying was needed. The EU was a very strong driver in many of these proposals, so that was fantastic. But also many countries in the Middle East and in Africa getting behind the proposals as well. So overall, a great day for shark species.
Why would Japan and China try to block these trade regulations? I mean, what is it? What's the problem there?
Well, unfortunately, it's demand in these countries that's driving the trade in sharks, the shark finning that we see going on at the moment. So unfortunately they continue to support this demand from their own consumers, but it's right and good that the international community has come together to decide that these 5 shark species should now be regulated.
Susan, tell us what it is about Japan and China when it comes to conservation. I mean, it almost looks as if they don't care. I mean, don't they like animals? What is it?
Well, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they also support conservation. I would stress that lobbying or the advocacy that it took to get to this day didn't start 2 weeks ago when the conference opened. And it didn't start 3 years ago after the last conference. There's been a lot of hard work to get governments to accept the applicability of CITES for these commercial marine species. Japan and China and others tried very hard to block this. I would add to what the previous speaker, Tom Quinn, said. The governments of Latin America were incredible here in sponsoring these proposals and working hard. You had virtually consensus of every country in Latin America on pushing for these proposals. For Japan, who's not really trading in shark fins and not consuming shark fins the way China does and Chinese communities do, it's almost a philosophical issue that they don't want an environmental conference relating to the conservation of marine species. But that view that they pushed very strongly did not prevail here. China feels the same way, but also is the main consumer globally of shark fins, shark products, as well as the gills of the manta rays. For China, they don't want to have any controls on these products.
So it's all about money,
But those views, the philosophical view, it's about money and it's about having to put the effort into enforcing something. But we're saying these governments are members of the treaty, and they agreed they have to go that extra mile for the species that are listed on CITES, and now these sharks and manta rays are on that list.
Okay, just a quick reminder now, the biggest deal to be struck at this year's CITES conference is the restriction on the export of sharks. And the shark trade is big business. Around 100 million of these animals are killed every year, mostly for their fins. In countries like China, shark fin soup is a luxury enjoyed by the upper class, and as a result, shark populations have been decimated around the world. As much as 90% of the world's sharks have disappeared over the last 100 years because of overfishing. Let's talk about what happened at the last CITES conference, Colman, here in Qatar. There was an attempt to get bluefin tuna, a ban on fishing that was pushed aside because of Japan, I believe. Does that mean it's just no longer an issue that'll disappear off CITES books forever?
I wouldn't say it will disappear off their books forever. It wasn't the first time it had been brought to CITES as an issue. It had been there before. But I think what has happened since then in the case of bluefin tuna is that the main RFMO that works in it has drastically cut down the amount of catch that it allows annually. And it did that in response to the outcry that led to it being discussed in Doha 3 years ago. So even though we didn't get it listed on the CITES appendices, as they're called back then, that was still a positive outcome for us. It led to good things, and that's where we're standing now.
Tom, how difficult is it, or how much of a challenge is it to balance cultural concerns and the environment?
Well, clearly, when the international community is deciding on these issues, it's always important to take into consideration historical factors. But clearly, for sharks and many other species, there's such an overriding environmental issue in terms of the need for their protection that actually we would argue, IFAW would argue that for the trade to be stopped, to be banned, or to be regulated is imperative.
Okay, but it's also up to people like me. I mean, certainly countries have to do their bit. I've got to stop eating shark fin soup, not that I ever would, but those who do, they need to be told, Susan, that it's uncool, that it's not right.
Yes, and I think there's a growing movement in China. There's a growing movement in Hong Kong and many ethnic Chinese communities around the world to reduce the consumption of shark fin soup. It is a luxury item. People often serve shark fin soup at weddings, but there is a growing move not to do that. Even within China itself, they've recently decided that government banquets would no longer serve shark fin soup. But I do want to stress that this CITES decision, while incredibly historic and important and significant, is not a ban for these species. It's a regulatory action to control the trade and make sure it's sustainable.
Should it be a ban?
But there are many governments around the world. Sorry?
Should it be a ban?
Should it be a ban is a different issue. Personally, I would rather there were no trade at all in these species. But for CITES to make this decision, it's just to regulate the trade. But there are many governments have gone one step further and said they don't want any fishing of sharks or manta rays in their waters, particularly for hammerheads and manta rays. They're worth tens of millions of dollars for ecotourism, a lot more alive than dead. And I think that's what needs to have more attention, which governments now in their own waters are taking important actions for sharks that are complementary.
Colman, how frightened are people of CITES and how effective CITES can be? Because I see that 8 nations, or 9 I believe at this stage, accused of failing to do enough to tackle the illegal trade in elephant ivory, escaped sanctions at this meeting. Why?
Well, they escaped sanctions at this stage, but they're under quite tight marching orders going up to the next intersessional meeting of CITES, which will happen in about a year's time. And yes, CITES is sometimes slow in its process as far concluding that a country isn't complying with the rules. But eventually, when they do make that conclusion, the compliance measures that they bring in are quite strict. They can effectively suspend all trade in CITES listed species with the country concerned. And considering that covers things like orchids from the horticulture industry, reptile leather and so on, that's quite a swinging measure to take against a country. And a measure like that was taken against Guinea already at the opening of this meeting because of its widespread enforcement lapses, some of which concern trade in great apes. So is it a good thing for
a country to be made an example of? Is that effective?
Well, of course, what we really look for is to see the trade made sustainable and to see the rules complied with. If there isn't scope for sustainable trade and if there's a trade ban applying, as is the case for great apes and for tigers, we want to see countries respect that. We want to see them do the things that avoid getting sanctions. But they need this credible threat of compliance measures if they persist over a long period in just ignoring the commitments that they have signed up to.
And Tom, what sort of law is there to complement this?
Well, clearly individual countries have to implement enforcement measures to ensure that the illegal trade in ivory in this case or in other species are properly enforced. As Colman was saying, I mean, it's no good having CITES come together and decide on things if the enforcement isn't there. So it's up to the individual countries to ensure that their enforcement measures and their legislation is strong enough to implement these international rules.
And I suppose at the end of the day, it's to try and catch the kingpin. Not an easy job, and I should imagine, in many cases, extremely dangerous. Susan?
Well, yes, I mean, unfortunately,
Yes.
In many cases, the penalties for wildlife crime are simply not sufficient. And so you have wildlife criminals who have a history in other crimes, in drugs, in weapons, in people trafficking, who will move and operate in wildlife trafficking and wildlife crime because, frankly, the penalties are much lower, but they can make the same kind of profit. So it's imperative that the international community does more to tackle this kind of crime.
Real nasty characters and very lucrative. Susan, you were going to say something.
No, what I was going to say is you're absolutely correct, and illegal trade in wildlife or in fisheries as well needs to be tackled and needs the political will of governments to do something about it. And there are many governments that don't have the financial means or the capacity, but do need the political will to attack the issue of poaching, illegal trade, and illegal fisheries. And there have been a lot of moves recently. Previous Secretary of State Clinton in the United States launched an effort of the United States to work with governments on illicit wildlife trafficking. We at the Pew Charitable Trust, working with the government of Norway and Interpol, recently launched a project on combating illegal fishing, which is a horrible problem on the high seas. But a lot more action needs to be taken at the government level.
And Colman, what about actions such as projects to put a stop to it, like banning fur advertisements, getting celebrities to condemn this? Does that sort of thing work so that people realize that it's not the right thing to do? Because so many animals die in transit. They die in people's homes in the first year.
Well, that certainly helps, but this kind of messaging has to be culturally appropriate as well if it's going to be effective. And it's not necessarily the case that the message that would work for a Chinese person would work for a British person or vice versa. So you do actually have to take into account your audience and what they perceive as cool and not cool. And we've been doing quite a bit with that, and again in relation to the shark fin trade in Hong Kong, for instance, getting the messaging out there. And we've been having quite a bit of success in persuading some of the food, hotel chains and so on, not to offer it as a standard menu item, for instance, for wedding banquets and that. But you must frame it in the correct cultural context, otherwise you don't succeed.
It'll backfire. Come on, tell us about rhinos and the increased protection of rhinos. What's going to happen after this CITES conference as far as that is concerned?
Well, with rhinos, the problem is focused basically between southern Africa, primarily South Africa itself, where poaching has been skyrocketing in the last few years, nearly 700 last year and already 150 this year. And nearly all of this trade is going either directly out of South Africa or via Mozambique to Vietnam. And Vietnam, even after being identified 3 years ago in Doha as a major player, has done very little to show that they're serious about combating the trade in this consumer market. So they, again, have a timetable of measures that they must enact over the next year or so, or else they too would face the threat of sanctions from CITES. And we will be keeping up the pressure on Vietnam. We're satisfied that South Africa is doing as much as they can, or pretty much as they can. Mozambique is also under the spotlight, but there's no doubt that at the moment the biggest problem is with Vietnam.
Tell us why it is so hard to apprehend these poachers. Is it because they're protected?
Well, it depends what level of the crime syndicate you're getting in at. Some of the successes have been at quite a low level in terms of catching the poachers themselves. Some of the organisers of the poaching gangs have been apprehended in South Africa. Most of the people convicted to date and given large sentences haven't been South African nationals. They've been Mozambican or Vietnamese or Thai. But even these people aren't at the very top of the trade chain. They're probably only 3 steps up out of 5. And It's quite possible that the kingpins are sitting in Vietnam, where really the level of enforcement at that side of the market has been quite, I would almost say, pathetic. The relatively few seizures have been made, and the punishments that have been handed out have been derisory.
Susan, what sort of role does DNA and the work done in laboratories do to point you in the right direction of who's failing in protecting animals, or indeed selling them or killing them?
Well, there's DNA methodology and other genetic tests and other methodologies used to identify wildlife products. And there are methods, for example, the sharks that were just protected here in CITES, there are visual methods to identify the fins, but also genetic methods to confirm the species and actually confirm even which ocean and where in the ocean the fins were taken from. But I want to get back to something that Colman mentioned, and I agree with everything he said. But when you talk about the poachers of wildlife, whether they're the poachers of wildlife on land or illegal fishers, they're doing something wrong, but they're being driven financially by these organized syndicates that run this trade, whether on illegal fishing or illegal trade in rhino horn, ivory trade, etc. And it's those syndicates that need to be stopped and need to be attacked, basically, at the highest level by governments. Governments know how to stop smuggling of drugs and smuggling of weapons, etc., and they need to put those tools into place for wildlife as well.
And Tom, what about regulating trade? I know that there's a school of thought in that direction in South Africa in particular.
Well, IFAW's position is very clear that while elephants or rhinos are being poached for their ivory or their tusks, that a trade in that product will only help fuel the crisis, because you fuel demand, you create a smokescreen for the illegal trade. So we would strongly say that trade should only be permitted when it's demonstrated that it doesn't have an adverse effect on poaching levels.
What do you think is going to be done now between this CITES conference and the next one in 3 years' time, Susan? What would you like to see being done and achieved?
Well, my focus particularly is on the sharks and rays, and I think between now and the next conference, the European Union has committed 1.2 million euros to assist governments with training and capacity building to properly implement these shark and manta ray new listings. And I think what needs to happen is other governments need to assist, and aid agencies, possibly the World Bank, and training needs to be provided so that between this conference and the next, these new listings can be effectively implemented. And that's extremely important. You were talking about rhinos and elephants. For these sharks, their trade isn't banned. The trade is regulated. So we want to be certain that for the first time that this fin trade is regulated, at least for these species, that it's properly implemented. So in terms of the sharks and manta rays, there may be more species proposed next time. It's really too early to discuss that. But that these listings are effective, and these species, the most important thing is this is about conservation. It's not about just regulating the trade, that these species begin their path to recovery.
Colman, is it true that if the will is there, the individual, the government can put a stop to this illegal trade and murder?
I think so, and I think there are models that show the way success can be achieved. The Queen conch, for example, in the Caribbean, for most of the time that I've worked in CITES, we used to worry a lot about it. But in recent years, the Caribbean countries themselves have shown us the way. They've grouped together. They're working in common to conserve this species. This is a very valuable species, both for its shell, but more particularly for its meat. So some similarities in that regard, and they've shown how the trade can be made sustainable. There are other examples too, like some of the timber species in Africa, some of the medicinal species like African cherry, where with help, if necessary, in the case of timber from the International Tropical Timber Organization and the EU, there's great work going on the ground to make sure that countries have the capacity, and poor communities even have the capacity, to follow these rules, to make a livelihood from the trade and to make the trade sustainable.
All right, Colman, on those words, let's end this Inside Story. Thanks very much for talking to us. In Bangkok, Colman O'Criodain, Susan Lieberman, and in London, Tom Quinn. As always, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, please email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.